Hi, everybody. On the heels of last week's fantastic talk with an evolutionary biologist, David Sloan Wilson, to show you my commitment to interdisciplinarity, today I'm talking with someone who is certainly not an evolutionary biologist, but is a very well-known cultural historian. Russell Jacoby is a distinguished professor of history at UCLA. How you doing, Russell?
I'm doing all right so far.
Very nice to meet you. I am aware of some of your books, although, and thank you for sending me the Last Intellectuals, which I've yet to read, and we'll talk about that in a second. But first, I want to give people a sense of some of the books that you've written. So let me just read some of them out. 1975, when I was stuck somewhere in Lebanon, fleeing for my life from execution from the adherents of the religion of peace. Social Amnesia, a critique of contemporary psychology. Well, as a consumer and evolutionary psychologist, I'd love to hear about some of those critiques. Then, of course, probably your most famous book, The Last Intellectuals, American Culture in the Age of Academe, Dogmatic Wisdom, How the Culture Wars Divert Education and Distract America, The End of Utopia, Politics and Culture in the Age of Apathy, Bloodlust on the Roots of Violence from Cain and Abel to the Present. And then finally, your forthcoming book, which we'll certainly talk about. It's coming out, I think, in February 2020, On Diversity, The Eclipse of the Individual in a Global Era by Seven Story Press. Did I cover most of the main ones?
You got it. You don't have my will in there, but I got a lot of stuff.
Oh, and I should mention, yesterday in preparation for the chat today, while I was on the elliptical, I watched a documentary, I think that came out in 2012, titled Velvet Prisons, Russell Jacoby on American Academia. I love the term velvet prison. There's a similar term, the golden handcuffs, when it comes to tenure. So I think that's a similar idea.
Right.
So I thought we would start, Russell, by, we won't go through all of your books, but certainly I want to spend a bit of time talking about the last intellectuals and, the tension between public intellectuals versus, careerist academics. And the first thing I want to mention, and I'm sure most of our viewers don't know this, is apparently the term public intellectual, while it briefly existed prior to you popularizing it in your book, you take credit for having popularized that term. Is that true?
I think there's some truth to that, yes. I believe that's true. I mean, yes, I think if you do a word search or something, it will show up. I think even John Stuart Mill may have used it once. I think it shows up in C. Wright Mills once or twice, the sociologist. But basically, it dates from my book where I introduce it, setting it against kind of like academic intellectuals. And trying to make a distinction. So I think if you look at its adoption, it dates from my book, basically. And has,
That's amazing. I've gotten in trouble by some of my very, very rare detractors who were upset and annoyed that in one of my bios, I think it was on Twitter, I've since taken it off because I've replaced it with these are my opinions only. You have to always have a kind of caveat emptor, buyer beware. These are my positions. It's not my university. But I used to have in my bio public intellectual, and some people thought that, oh, that's so haughty and obnoxious. But what I meant in using that term, and tell me if that's how you meant when you originally used it in your book, I mean that I step out of my lab. I step out of the strict disciplinary boundaries of my field. And as a professor, not representing my university, but as someone who is trained to think, I hope, I weigh in on issues outside of my realm of expertise. And in that sense, I'm hence a public intellectual. I don't mean it as an elitist statement. Is this how you meant the term?
Yes, but I think you're being very cautious, in fact, because at least my argument is that the term intellectual, basically in its sort of French use, it was people who were stepping out of their disciplines. I mean, it was people who were intervening in public affairs. The notion that you have to stick to a discipline, is in some sense a more recent idea. I mean, intellectuals were not so discipline defined, so that a public intellectual, the way I was using it, was trying to recapture something which belonged to the term intellectual. And the problem was we saw an academic intellectuals emerging who were intellectuals, but were totally professionalized and would never step out of their field.
And I mean, you could be a public intellectual a la Christopher Hitchens, who didn't hold an academic position, who didn't have a PhD, and yet you can oftentimes have academic, professional intellectuals who I would consider don't really have an intellectual bent, right? They are strong methodologists, right? They know how to conduct experiment to test some psychological principle, but ask them to say to utter two syllables outside, the methodological fixation. I love that term by Sternberg and Grigorenko, methodological fixated. Short of, once you ask them to get out of their lane, then they completely break down. So you could be a public intellectual without being a professor and a doctor and a PhD and the rest of it, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and as you kind of indicated, there could be an inverse relationship. The more training or professionalism you have, the more cautious or lack of ability you have to say anything which speaks to public or contemporary issues. And I think.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I mean that becomes part of the problem of professionalization of the intelligentsia, that it loses its ability to address issues.
Now, why do you think academics have become or have been, cautious? Is it because they don't feel sufficiently self-confident to weigh in areas outside of their strict expertise? Is it because there aren't the reward mechanisms in universities to reward such engagement? Is it both of these things and others? Before you answer, I mean, let me first hear your answer, and then I'll probably build a few other things on top of it.
I don't have an answer. I mean, I don't have a complete answer. I mean, one is dealing with bureaucratization, routinization, specialization. We see all these happening in these fields. How do you measure public impact? Well, you can. So let's measure professional impact. Journal citations. So that over the years and decades, and I mention I think in my book on the last intellectuals. I mean, for years. In the university, to say someone's work was journalistic was a condemnation. That meant that other people could understand it. Right? It was journalistic, right? How is it your work is journalistic? Other people in other fields could. That means you weren't serious.
It should only be 3 people that are anointed within the ivory tower that should be able to relate to your work. Otherwise, you are a vulgarizer. You're not a serious guy.
Exactly. So there was a premium on being insular, or at least being narrow and specialized, and there was a question if you were understood outside those parameters.
Well, go ahead.
No, so this took a terrible toll. I mean, it still does, I think. I mean, this idea that somehow if you intervene in public discourse, you're not a serious professional.
Well, I mean, this is certainly something that I have faced in my career as someone who has certainly developed a very, if I may say, a large platform. This is a story that I've told before, but it's worth repeating. A few years ago, I was invited to speak at Stanford Business School. So, I mean, it doesn't get more, elitist ivory tower than that. And the guys there are, the folks there are, brilliant academics. They're great scholars. But at one point I had gone out prior to the next day I was giving a talk at Stanford Business School. So the gentleman who had taken me out to dinner, we were having a chat during dinner, and he said, "Oh, I didn't know that you were, such a quote celebrity, that you appear on all these shows and so on. You've appeared on Joe Rogan many times. If you don't know, Russell, who Joe Rogan is, he arguably has the most popular platform in the world. He's probably more powerful in his reach than all of the mainstream media combined. And and I was, certainly one of the first academics to go on his show. Precisely because I navigate in the currency of ideas. And if I can go on your show and there'll be 20 million downloads, then it doesn't take a fancy mimeticist to recognize that the memes associated with my appearing on your shows are going to spread a lot further than if I have an academic paper where only 100 people are going to, read it or cite it.
Right.
And so his position, this is the Stanford guy, was, well, at Stanford, we don't condone this type of thing. We don't condone research that can then be popularized on Joe Rogan. To which I answered, it's not an either or proposition. You could publish in the top peer-reviewed journals and appear on Joe Rogan. But he saw it as an either or. They were mutually exclusive. You either publish in Psychological Science and Journal of Consumer Psychology, or you go on Joe Rogan. Well, guess what? I've done both.
Right.
So how do we get academics to break out of that highfalutin, obnoxious elitism?
We can't.
We cannot?
I'm not sure, but I totally agree. And again, I argue, the great figures of the past, and from Karl Marx to Sigmund Freud or whatever, they wrote specialized works, but they also wrote public works. It was not either or. It was both. They could do it. They could wear two hats, as it were. So this seems to be possible. I ask my students, regularly. I say, "Can you name a philosopher today, a contemporary North American philosopher?" They can't.
Right.
The point is, the field is so specialized that these people play no role. But in principle, sure, you should be able to write in two different ways. You should be able to wear two hats. You should be able to intervene. But we don't see that.
See, I think so. Remember earlier I asked you what do you think are some of the causes? So some of it might indeed be true due to the fact that, look, universities don't have explicit reward mechanisms to reward people for public engagement. But I also think, so this is the added explanation, which I'd love for you to comment on, to tell me if you think I'm onto something. When you are selecting Navy SEALs, there's a set of traits that you are looking for. And if you don't pass these particular traits, these minimal traits, then you're simply not going to be a good Navy SEAL. Now let's apply that to academia. I would like to think that academics should be the Navy SEALs of cerebral life. So they should be courageous. They should be able to do cerebral push-ups and pull-ups. Yet we actually select for temerity. Most of the people who go into academia, and I hope I'm not being too vulgar in sort of my generalization, but again, you'll tell me what you think. They're not likely to have been guys or girls who have played as the star quarterback or star soccer player. And so one of the fundamental traits that you need to go from your strict lab to the public is to have, forgive the term, testicular fortitude, but yet we don't select for that in academia. So you end up with a bunch of guys and girls who suck their thumb in a corner in a fetal position because they're afraid if they share their ideas in the public arena, then they're going to be hammered. So better to be safe and stay within my little circle of 4 people. What do you think of this theory?
I think it has something to be said. Obviously, it's a career, and there's a way to advance in the career. And again, and I think the weight of counsel is you don't upset the cart, the boat. You write the journal article. You make your small contribution, and you don't deviate from that. And in that sense, I think we do see the routinization of the intelligentsia, which happens in the university. Now, obviously, there are exceptions to that. Again, I say in the last intellectuals, we had sociologists, like C. Wright Mills, he was a radical sociologist. Well, now we have, thousands of radical sociologists, but who are they?
Right.
We don't, they are much more specialized than he ever was. We don't hear from them, really.
He was the guy, I think, in the documentary that you were mentioning, he would build houses and so on. So he kind of had a blue. So that kind of speaks to my point, right? My Navy SEAL analogy, right?
Exactly. And he was a kind of a macho. Yes, he drove motorcycles, he built stuff. But he wrote books, for the public at the same time. But yes, his successors are leftists in his mold, but they're specialized sociologists, and they disappear into these journals and conferences. Marxist, sociologists have conferences. Who are they?
Right.
We don't know, really.
Well, I'm sure you've probably heard this bibliometric, metric, passed around. I think something like, I hope I'm not butchering this, but it's almost right. Someone will probably check it and correct me in the comment section. Something like 50% of academic papers across all disciplines will never be cited ever, not once. I mean, that's not a good number. And even if I'm a bit off, if it's cited once or twice or 5 times, I mean, for those of you who are listening, it takes a tremendous amount of effort to go through a peer review process, never mind to actually conduct the research prior to sending the paper to the journal. So you're talking about 2, 3, 4 years of very hard work. And it's quite disheartening to then know that maybe 4, 5 people will cite your work. And in a sense, that's one of the reasons why I'm so thrilled by all of these new opportunities to share ideas, right? I mean, I couldn't have talked to Russell Jacoby, 10 years ago, whereas now we could hook up by email and then, a few days later, we're speaking to each other. I know you don't seem to be very optimistic. We could get academics. How do we get academics to appreciate that there are so many more tools beyond the traditional mediums of delivery for them to engage the cerebral life?
Well, I mean, it has been talked about at various points that part of tenure, part of promotion should be your public contribution. Sort of incorporated into the promotion. Perhaps. I mean, it's been talked about at various times.
Have any schools? Do you know of any schools that have implemented it?
No.
Okay. Okay, so it's still just being talked about.
And how do you do that? I mean, how do you measure public impact? We see it some schools, and I think some decisions like try to take into consideration public profile in certain ways. So
go ahead. Now, in your case, I mean, so far we've been talking about being a strict academic, careerist academic versus being a public intellectual, getting out there, talking about other issues. But if we stick within academia, you could also talk about being sort of a strict depth researcher, meaning, you specialize in a very narrow area, and then for the next 40 years, you publish incremental epsilons within that area. Or you could be much more of an interdisciplinary, which I think you are. If I were to read, well, as I read the titles of your various books, you are covering a very, very broad range of areas. You're critiquing psychology, you're talking about the roots of violence, you're talking about intellectual life. In my own work, I've published in medicine and psychology, in bibliometrics, in marketing and consumer behavior, in economics. But as you know, certainly, given sort of your unique career trajectory, academic rewards don't reward the interdisciplinarity. Even though most universities from this side of their mouth will say we support interdisciplinarity, from this side, they'll erect all of the possible obstacles and barriers. Am I describing this correctly?
I think absolutely. I mean, there's endless talk about interdisciplinary work, but in fact, there remains specialties and subspecialties, which is the way the whole system works. And without getting too boring in autobiography, I mean, I never had a discipline loyalty, and basically never got tenure because no one never saw what field I belonged in. I wasn't a German historian. I wasn't a European intellectual historian because I wrote on America. It was unclear what field I was in. So on one hand, there's a lot of talk about, yes, we need broad perspectives. On the other hand, basically the institutions are based on specialties and subspecialties. So that's how hiring goes.
I mean, most of the important scientific breakthroughs of the past 20, 30, 40 years, if there's one thing in common across very, very different types of scientific breakthroughs, is precisely in how interdisciplinary the teams that cracked that particular discovery were, right? So the mapping of the human genome didn't come from biologists or only geneticists, or, it needed people from biostatistics, from computer science, from genetics, from biology. And so you could look up a whole bunch of academic papers that talk about how laudable it is to be interdisciplinary. But as you said, and as I said originally, the universities don't practice that. So, for example, about 10 years ago now, I tried to institute the epitome of an interdisciplinary program at Concordia, which was going to be a model of the program at SUNY Binghamton. Actually, my last guest is the guy who created that program. He's an evolutionary biologist. It was an evolutionary studies minor. So basically, the idea is that since evolutionary theory transcends across disciplines, right? You could study medicine from an evolutionary perspective. You could study consumer behavior, as I do, from an evolutionary perspective. You could study politics or history from an evolutionary perspective. So the idea would be to create an evolutionary studies minor that any student could take irrespective of what their home discipline is. So that would have been exactly me heeding the call of interdisciplinarity. Well, guess what? Every single dean that I tried to pitch the idea to suddenly became very defensive about the territoriality of their faculty, and it went nowhere. Do you have any thoughts as to how we might be able to break through that obstacle?
Hammers.
Right.
I really don't know. I mean, I think you're right. It's very difficult to do it, and even though the talk is always, we want to set up interrelations between disciplines. I think when push comes to shove, and all the counsel to any young professor is you have to make your contribution, and it has to fit in to what people are doing, and it has to be small. And if it's small and it's important, you'll be recognized. But you can't do a broad contribution. And I think, yes, you run against the realities of the disciplines.
Do you regret having, given the career path that you've had, sitting at, you're in a later stage of your career, if I may say, hopefully you may have 25 more years, but, you've seen it all. Do you look back now and say, I wish I had been more of a careerist, I would have been elsewhere? Or on the contrary, the journey that you've had has been so enriching that you couldn't give a damn today?
No, it's more the latter. I don't regret. I had years where, I taught 3 years in Canada. I wandered around.
At Concordia?
One at Concordia, right. Simon Fraser. I wandered around because no one wanted to hire me. And one of the reasons was, well, what's your field? Right. We don't quite get it. What do you do? Your contributions don't fit in. So no, I certainly don't regret writing on various subjects which don't easily fit into prevailing boxes. But I think it's hard for people who follow, and it's not. I tell students not all the time when they ask me about they want to be intellectuals or something, and they don't want to study, become narrow. I said, well, it's very simple. You either have to have a very rich wife or have a trust fund or something,
or a rich husband.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's right. You're gonna get the diversity police after you. Come on, man.
Okay, so it's very simple. But if you hope to, get a job and have a career, you got to choose a specialty.
Yeah.
And command it.
Yeah, I always struggle with this issue when I'm offering advice to my doctoral students, right? Because I want to be grounded in reality, and so if the rules of the game are that you have to have a bit of a careerist bent, then I have to at least make them aware that this is how you're going to succeed. But on the other hand, I also want to explain to them that there is infinite pleasure and value in being iconoclastic, in wanting to navigate through many intellectual landscapes, as I have. But I'm always sort of cognizant of the fact that I don't want to simply give them the positives of my interdisciplinarity without recognizing that the field won't necessarily reward them. So I'm always torn as to how to guide them.
No, exactly. I'm totally serious. I tell students who say, well, I don't, I want to be an intellectual, I want to this. I said, fine. I said, but you need someone to support you, right, or you need a trust fund. You're not going to, you're not going to be able to earn your living as an intellectual in this culture anymore. You need a specialty, and you need a graduate degree, and you're going to have get a job, period.
Now, interesting in your case, from when I watched the documentary, when you went to grad school, it wasn't with the clear, trajectory of I want to become a professor, which is actually a very different experience from mine, because from a very young age, I knew that I was really interested in only two things in life: being a professional soccer player and being a professor. So when I went through my trajectory, I knew. Sorry?
How did the soccer work out?
I had a career-ending injury. I was a very competitive soccer player, hopefully heading to play professionally in Europe. And then at 17 years old in the Canadian Championships, I had a very severe injury that ended it all for me. And so then I knew that there was only one path remaining. But in your case, that wasn't the case. Maybe you could tell us a bit about it. How did you kind of fall on academia?
But it was more a generational thing, I believe, in my case. I mean, unlike later generations, for whatever reason, we were not so career oriented. I mean, point of getting jobs and becoming professors, even though if you look at it, yes, I went to graduate school, but, I love being a student. The notion of becoming a professor, it didn't really dawn on me that this is what you were doing. And this was true for many of many students in my cohort. I mean, we weren't going to graduate school to become professors. We had been students. We loved being students, and we went to graduate school. But it wasn't with a clear goal of like, I want to be a professor.
Got it.
And I think that was more typical of that generation, which wasn't obsessed as much as this generation with getting jobs and careers, for whatever reason.
I see sort of the job perspective a lot with my group of students, in that, and not necessarily the PhD students, but being housed in a business school, what ends up happening is many of the students, although some of the brightest, because it's probably one of the hardest things to get into the top business schools, many of them are not intrinsically motivated, right? I mean, if you're studying Sanskrit, a dead language, then it's probably not because you are predicting that the job opportunities for an expert in Sanskrit are going to be great next year. You're doing it for the intrinsic love of that particular course of study. But when you go, for example, to pursue an MBA, now many might be there because they certainly wish to learn, and many of my MBA students are terribly bright. But many are not there to learn. They're there because there's going to be a few letters after their name that are going to make them jump up a peg in terms of their salaries. And that's something that I find very frustrating, because I'm very much of a purist as a pedagogue. So when someone asks me, is this going to help me in my job? Is this going to be on the exam? I take that as an injury to the process, right? Because you should just be there for the purity of learning. Do you think that happens less in your field precisely because you're not at a business school?
The professional orientation?
The fact that some of the students might not be there necessarily because of their love for learning, right? Now, most people don't say, it's my dream to get an MBA because I want to learn more about managerial accounting. But whereas learning about some ancient Greek classics issue is more likely to draw people who are intrinsically motivated. Is that your sense from your students?
Well, again, I think part of the issue, and I ask my students this as well, everyone is obsessed increasingly with jobs and careers in a way that is a bit paralyzing, I guess. And yes, it has affected history, English departments, places where you think, yes, people are there for the learning. But that is, I think certainly diminished over time. They're very concerned, I suppose legitimately with, the job, getting a job. So they want to orient their studies to a field where there's jobs.
Right.
And I always ask, how is it we have become more obsessed with careers as society's gotten wealthier? Basically, we're getting richer and richer as a society, and yet we're more and more anxious about jobs and careers. Right. How do those things go together? I say,
do you have an answer for that?
No, I don't. I say, I don't think you're going to end up homeless. Why are you so obsessed by this? You come in with a good family, you'll be all right. But No, everyone is anxious about this increasingly. So yes, I think in history as well. I mean, people are concerned like, where's the job? What's the field? What's the subfield? Where are they going to be hiring? Exactly that.
Is it often the case that people will go into, and maybe here I'm being stereotypical, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, they go into history to get sort of a first level education, but then the goal is to go to law school, right? So it's a stepping stone to then that professional accreditation.
Oh, it's very common. Yeah. Very common. Yeah. But I agree. The idea of a liberal education is in principle application. I mean, it is to learn for the sake of learning. It's to become a citizen, to understand something about how to be a person. I mean, I say that's why you don't go to law school out of high school or medical school.
Right.
I mean, the whole point, and we see, it's true UCLA, I'm sure it's true Concordia and elsewhere, the multiplication of sort of more business or career-minded majors and minors, pre-accounting, pre-business, pre-this, pre-that, which basically violate the idea of a liberal education.
Right. Got you. As someone who's been switching gears slowly as we get to your recent book, so this is kind of the segue. In 1994, you wrote Dogmatic Wisdom, which I've had in my personal library for many years, but I am sorry to say I haven't read yet. But I did a quick sort of search to get the main tenets. So let me summarize them and then tell me if this is right. You were basically arguing there that people are spending too much time worrying about multiculturalism and political correctness and freedom of speech issues when there are other things that we should be worried about in terms of campus life. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, it's certainly part of the story. Yeah, yes.
Now, yes. That was written in 94. Now we are 2019, 25 years later, where the campus lunacy has gone on hypersteroid. Do you think that you maybe underestimated the extent to which some of these forces, which I call idea pathogens, have taken hold in the universities?
It's a good question, but I am not sure. Certainly, yes, maybe I would say I underestimated, but I still believe, if you look at, most of the issues about political correctness, about free speech, take place at the elite schools, where 5% of the students are going. If you look at the big schools, the community colleges, where hundreds of thousands, these issues are not arising. So again, there is still that. What is the implications? I probably agree. I underestimated its impact, but I'm still not clear. All these events are taking place at a few schools and not at the majority schools.
I think I would probably agree with you, and I would say that even at those elite few schools, the percentage of people who are espousing those views are in the minority. But here is the analogy that I would make to actually argue that we shouldn't underestimate their influence. Well, first of all, those few minorities become the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, right? So, in other words, right? And you didn't need 19 million committed hijackers to bring down the two World Trade Centers. You only needed 19 people, not 19,000, not 190,000, not 19 billion. So it doesn't take, a rabid bunch of morons and imbeciles on campuses to hold the rest of us hostage. It just takes a few very loud, committed activists to keep everybody in check. So the fact that they're at a few schools and they are few in numbers at those schools, to me, doesn't make me feel any better. What do you think?
Right. I think that's probably true. And the diversity stuff, I think, is a clear example. One can all see it starts, at Harvard, statements, which are made in applications and admissions places at a few schools, and spreads out so that it would be false to simply say, well, it's restricted to a few schools.
Which leads us to your book on diversity. lay out the full synopsis of what this forthcoming book is all about, which I'm very excited to read.
You want me to lay it out? Well, I mean, it is taking up the ideology of diversity. And I begin to argue that a lot of it is ideology, and that its reality is tenuous. That somehow the world is becoming more and more globalized and homogeneous. At the same time as we are pretending we're more and more diverse. And even in the natural world, where again, biologists and others have certainly, and ecologists have said we're losing diversity in the natural world. And yet when we turn to the human world, we are apparently becoming more diverse. And I think all the evidence suggests the opposite. We're not becoming more diverse. It's almost, that the ideology of diversity sort of intensifies as the reality declines.
Right. Now, when you're talking about diversity, I actually, one of the examples that I give in my forthcoming book is from UCLA, where I can't remember the name of the office, some fascist kind of title, the Office of Proper Thinking, or otherwise you will be sent to Gulag 13-Diversity Office, right? And now professors, as they apply for tenure, have to, or even when they apply to get a job at UCLA, have to kind of sign a statement that they are committed to diversity. And again, diversity in the way that it is used at universities is not the positive sense of diversity. Are you aware of that stuff happening at UCLA, given that you are at UCLA?
Yes, I believe. Yeah, I mean, it's part of every
university.
University. I mean, you have to make diversity statements. You have to indicate how you're promoting diversity. You have to indicate your love of diversity. You have to indicate you're opposed to anyone who hates diversity.
In some cases, by the way, you now have to argue how you might incorporate within the epistemology of your research diversity issues. So it's not only my lab should have a diversity of gender orientations, which is insane, because I'd like to think that people should choose the best soccer players and the best scientists, irrespective of their gender orientation or whether they ovulate or not. But it seems extraordinary that what we study now has to be infused with the ethos of diversity. I mean, it's insane.
Well, it does. I mean, I talk in my class. I mean, yes. Do we teach astrology next to astronomy? I mean, is that where it's come to? I mean, like we have, there's, we have the astrologists and we have the astronomers, right?
Right.
They're both, two different viewpoints. Obviously not. But the ideology, I believe, is flowering as the reality declines. I mean, that's part of the argument here, and that we see this across the board. I mean, all this diversity stuff doesn't suggest that there's real diversity in terms of real choices of people, what they want in life, what they're doing. Everyone seems to agree on sort of, consumer capitalism or success in very conventional terms. I mean, so what is the diversity about? I mean,
well,
is it just
race diversity, religious diversity, gender diversity, gender orientation diversity, all of the things that shouldn't matter, and the only thing that should matter, which is intellectual diversity, that's the one that we don't want.
Okay, well, in that sense, yes, we have increasing group diversity, and I believe, and I don't know the latest research, but even in places like UCLA, we have declining economic diversity. I mean, these places become more homogeneous in terms of the economics of the families who go to it. And I think this is true in many schools. But sure, I think, so this is one of the things I'm beginning to ask about, that how does this ideology seem to flower when, if you look at the world and you look at what people are doing, what they're wearing, what they're speaking, what they're watching, diversity is weakening. It's not disappearing, obviously, but it's weakening. And all the diversity ideology doesn't speak to that at all. I mean, it pretends we're getting more and more different, even though everyone drives and looks increasingly similar. I mean, they wear the same stuff, they drive the same cars, they watch the same stuff, more or less, and yet we're all diverse. How
Right.
can that?
Now, do you offer prescriptions to combat? By the way, and feel free to use it with proper attribution. I call it the die religion: diversity, inclusion, and equity. It's the die religion because it really is. It's a form of secular quasi religion, right? The priests of the die religion are the folks in the office of equity and so on, the equity, right? Where they ask that we prostrate ourselves in agreeing with the tenets of the faith, right? I mean, obviously, this is a frontal assault on the most fundamental tenet of classical liberalism, right? The dignity of the individual. Do you see eventually this whole thing auto-correcting and we go back to sort of a more sane position in terms of the lever? Or is this going to keep getting wilder and wilder until we fall off the abyss of infinite lunacy?
I like autocorrect. Yeah, good luck with that. Uh, I can't see the future, but I mean, there's no sign of it weakening at the
Right.
moment. And again, we've seen these diversity offices gotten huge over the last couple of years. I mean, they're staffed by scores of people, and what do? I mean, they're monitoring, they're regulating. So if you're looking, what is going to happen down the pike, I don't know. It's not promising at the moment, but I don't think the globe looks too promising at the moment either. So,
I'd like us to walk away with some optimism. So here's let me infuse this. Let me infuse us with some optimism.
okay,
I recently posted a letter that I read. I receive, for better or worse, I've become the central repository of all sorts of people, professors, students, parents
okay,
of students who write to me sharing the lunacy that they are experiencing on campuses. And so I
right,
keep all of these, and once in a while I will read one. Of course I will take out the identifying marker of the person. So there was a letter that I read a few weeks ago by a student who was sharing with me how much he despised the ethos of diversity, and he is someone who comes from a minority group, and he finds it to be offensive. It's the old soft bigotry of low expectations and so on and so forth. And I think the reality is that there's a silent majority, all of whom share our disdain for some of these ideas, but yet they are cowered into silence. And the goal becomes to simply get people to have enough courage to stand up in unison. And if they can do that, then that autocorrection that I talked about will happen. But as long as everybody is cowered into silence, then the few activists will continue to dominate. Does that make sense?
yes, it does make sense. But I'm not. I mean, you're calling on people to have some courage, I suppose. And I agree. And to bring it to other things, I mean, like I think the right wing populism, which we see everywhere in the world, is partially a response to the timidity of the critics of diversity, if I could put it that way. I
Well,
mean, it's not
Trump is a response to that stuff, right?
okay. In some sense, yes, that you don't. People see that basically too much of it is a fraud, and that if you don't have liberals and leftists say that, they actually abet a reaction, a conservative populist reaction, which we see everywhere in some ways. I mean, again, it's not cause and effect, but I think too many people do see it as a scam and a fraud, and there's an aspect of it, which is there is an aspect of fraud and deception. But sure, I mean, to call upon people to say, look, this is, if you want to say a religion or it's an ideology, and we have to really look at what it means. And is it just group representation? Is that all we're talking about? So that any group has to be proportionate to its place in society. We need more short people playing basketball.
Then I would be an NBA star.
All of us, man. I mean, we need more Jews in the NBA, right?
That's what I always say.
How many are there?
Not many.
Not many, no.
Well, Muggsy Bogues was 5'3", shortest player. I mean, he wasn't Jewish, but I'm talking about the height. Did you know that the shortest player to ever play in the NBA, 5'3"? Muggsy Bogues. Do you know who that is?
No.
Yeah. I mean, I would tower over him, and on a good day, I'm no more than about 5'6.5", 5'7". So there you go. So
on a good day. What about a bad day?
On a bad day, my hair is flatter, and then I'm 5'6" at most.
Okay.
But look, I've made the point. The top 25 rushers of all time in the NFL, 24 out of the 25 are black. One is white, John Riggins from the Washington Redskins. Why doesn't the Office of Diversity at the NFL go up in arms at the lack of proportional representation there? Same thing with the top NBA scorers, lack of representation of whites. Same thing with who's won the Boston Marathon over the past 35 years. And it goes on and on. So, it doesn't take a sophisticated thinker to see the terminal hypocrisy whereby in some domains we need to intervene to create, a artifactual diversity, but in others we don't have to. It's insane.
Right. I mean, I assume people would say, well, athletic performance is one thing and academics is something else, and you can't measure it the same way. But yes, I think there is a problem with this kind of rigid proportionality as diversity, and I think the critics are right to talk about intellectual diversity. I mean, if you have group diversity and you don't have intellectual diversity, what does that mean? And the problem is, how do you get intellectual diversity? And again, part of my book is to argue that the great liberal thinkers, John Stuart Mill and Tocqueville, we're concerned with this very issue, that we're losing intellectual and individual diversity. And I don't think they were wrong. And one of the issues which hovers on the edge of my book is sort of the rise of the masses, of fascism, of an electorate which doesn't really have any independence and individuality because it's just being fed tweets and video snippets. And this is worrisome for the future of democracy.
Do you get at all into your book into the political diversity or lack thereof of the core of professors? And of course, as you probably know, there are many, many wonderful studies done throughout academic institutions and usually American institutions, but similar studies have been done in Canada where you show that the lopsidedness of Democrat to Republicans is simply astonishing, especially the more you go into the humanities and the social sciences. Is this something that you address in your book?
It's not something I really address in my book. I have written about it on and off elsewhere. And I must say, I'm not totally impressed with it. Or let me put it this way. First of all, why not include the sciences? Which, I mean, nowadays, I mean, in the university, the humanities are dwindling, basically. And, the sciences and engineering are expanding. That's where the money and the power is. So it seems to me that the political complexion, if that's the issue, is more important in those fields, and they're usually excluded in these studies because I think it's not so clear what the politics are. But also, it's not, which is something I say in the last Intellectuals, in some ways stepping back, what does it mean if English departments are run by Marxists? I mean, in some sense, the conservatives were smart. They said, let's take our leftists and put them in English departments, right? where no one will listen to them, and they'll have their graduate students, and they'll write, opaque books for each other.
I don't think so. I think they become prime ministers of Canada. That's my point. There's a downstream effect of training these guys in really bad ideas.
On the other hand, I mean, okay, maybe Canada. Look at the United States. I mean, so we have Marxist English departments, and we have conservatives in the Supreme Court and the rest of the places of power. So you say, how does that work out? So the professoriate is leftist and the country is rightist. And I once wrote something. I said, look, we would trade every English department in the United States for the Supreme Court, right? I mean, that would be a good deal, right? You give us the Supreme Court, and we'll put conservatives, throughout the English departments.
Right.
So the impact of some of that argument is not clear to me. That we have more Democrats, by a huge number in humanities, So what?
So let me offer a counterpoint, if I may. So, by the way, some of those studies that you mentioned do include things like the neurosciences, engineering, medicine, the business school. As you go to those disciplines where they are constrained by this thing called reality, right? Building a bridge using postmodernist tenets doesn't work, right? Doing neurosurgery using postmodernist tenets doesn't work. Developing effective advertising using postmodernist tenets doesn't work. So as you go to the more either natural sciences or the professional fields, the lopsidedness of the professoriate becomes lesser. It's still, though, largely more Democrat. As you go to the social sciences and humanities, the reason why it is overwhelmingly dominated by Democrats, and now again, not that there's anything wrong with Democrats versus Republican, but some of the what I call parasitic ideas, some of the idea passages, the postmodernism and the rejection of biology and the radical feminism, the problem with those fields is that they are decoupled from reality, right? So you are doing a great disservice to young students, many of whom will become future leaders. I take your point. Some of them don't end up sitting on the Supreme Court, but culture today, I think the intelligentsia of culture is largely dominated by leftist thinkings, the media, academia, journalism. These are all disciplines that are incredibly lopsided to the left. Now, if I am a parent of a child, if they are studying neurosciences, the political bent of the professor doesn't matter. But if they're studying political science, right, where or economics, where we're talking about what is the appropriate fiscal policy, is the death penalty moral or not? There is no right or wrong. There are very valuable positions that come from both sides of the aisle. So when you remove that political diversity from those who are teaching our children, I think our children are cheated. What do you think?
Again, I don't know if I completely disagree, but there's some conservatives, and I mentioned that in my book, have argued we need affirmative action for conservatives in the university. Which strikes me as, wow, this is really bizarre, right? So now there'll be one more box to check, right? Where are you on the political spectrum? And if you're a conservative, you get extra points. So, how does one, is the FBI, police departments more conservative than English departments? Probably. There is some kind of natural selection going on here, which seems impossible to, change. And also, again, I'm not so sure what the consequences are in terms of some of the humanities. I agree, some of the postmodernism is nuts. On the other hand, I'm not sure what its impact is. Or let me put it this way. Part of the impact has been suicidal, because I think English departments and some, have, to the degree they become postmodern and don't study literature, they lose, people are not studying it anymore. They're not so interested.
I would actually argue that, and again, maybe this might be too purist on my part, but you'll tell me what you think. I would argue that the consequences of postmodernism are actually outlandishly grave, because there's nothing more dangerous to the human condition than a frontal attack on reason, on science, on logic, right? Postmodernism is that's why it's called anti-science, right? It's postmodernism that caused someone that I was talking to in 2002, this is a story that I've told many times and is in my latest book, that in 2002, well before the whole transgender activism issue, in 2002, I was called a ridiculous bigot, a sexist, for arguing that only women can bear children within Homo sapiens. This was considered by this postmodernist to be a truly contentious position. This was in 2002. In 2014, I went to the highfalutin Wellesley College, where a student, after my talk, thought that it was perfectly reasonable for a professor to pull his or her students at the start of every class about their changing gender identities. Well, that might have seemed like a strange exercise being discussed in a seminar at Wellesley. Well, today people go to jail for making some of these violations. I had to appear with Jordan Peterson, a fellow Canadian professor, in front of the Canadian Senate to explain to the Canadian Senate in the 21st century that there is such a thing as male and female. And we do come in these two polymorphic states called male and female, notwithstanding that we fully support the rights of transgender people. So I would argue that postmodernism is not some little thing that's only in some seminar in linguistics. It is a frontal attack on reason and common sense.
Okay, I don't know if I completely disagree.
But we disagree about nothing.
Oh no, and one of the things which is coming out of that, which has been adopted everywhere, I mean, just the term about someone's narrative, which is coming out of post. I mean, we hear this all the time. This is someone's narrative. This is another narrative.
This is my truth.
Yeah, so it's coming out of this postmodern. People have different narratives, and that's the way it is. So it does seep out into other areas. There's no doubt. But I'm still unclear, what the impact in some of these humanities departments are, besides, I say, a kind of insularity and a loss of students. Because I say it way back in Last Intellectuals, who are the leading American Marxists? And some, like one is, Fred Jameson. Well, he's he's an English, professor of English. Who knows about him? He's, the leading American Marxist. If you would know about him if you study, English department, if you're a grad student. But most people wouldn't know who that is. So what's the impact? But I'm not totally disagreeing that we see this, filtering out or seeping out this lingo and this idea.
Right. What do you think about moving from postmodernism, which, as I said, in its most radical form, becomes a form of rejection of reality and anti-science, right? I think you mentioned in your in the documentary that Judith Butler, who I guess is the perennial winner of the most ridiculous, obtuse, gibberish, nonsensical sentence, or as I like to call it, any postmodernist writer ever, right? Right. Now, before I ask my question, a small parenthesis. I've argued with some of my other guests, and let's see if you'll buy into my theory, that the original postmodernists, or who I like to call the holy trinity of French postmodernist bullshitters, Michel Foucault, Jacques Lacan, and Jacques Derrida, it was really an evolutionary process, right? So I'm one of them. I'm sitting on my campus, and I feel as though the biologists and the physicists and the chemists and the neuroscientists are getting all of the kudos. They're really the top guys in the pecking order. And the only way that I could now get some of those ego strokes is if I create a language that is as impenetrable as that of the mathematicians and the physicists. So I'm going to construct an edifice of, illusions that appears as though it has this faux profundity because it is the Lacanian hermeneutics of my praxis that is the eigenvalue of my transposed self. I just made that up, right? It sounds as though it is deep. It really says nothing, but it must be that you don't understand it because you are dumb, not because I am a fraudulent scammer. Do you think that maybe Michel Foucault and the rest of that gang were precisely doing what I'm saying, or do you actually think they believed in their nonsense?
They certainly believed in their nonsense. I don't think that refutes your point. And I tend to agree, but I don't think it was intentional in the way you're putting it. I mean, I have a very again, my book, The Last Intellectuals, dealt with American intellectuals, but the project originally was to deal with French, German, and English intellectuals as well. And one of the arguments was not so dissimilar, that we see after sort of Jean-Paul Sartre, we see a new generation of French intellectuals emerging, which were much more academic and much more insular and much more opaque than the sort of the previous French intellectuals. So they had the reputation that French intellectuals had, but they tended to be incomprehensible, and that became one of their marks. And so in that sense, I don't think they say, well, let's be that wasn't the intent, but in fact, I think it's basically true. And the Judith Butler, who responded to some of the criticism, by appealing to the tradition of T.W. Adorno and others, saying, well, we speak the language of Hegel, of profundity, which is not the language of common sense, and that becomes the sort of excuse for our difficult language. But obviously, that's an excuse. I mean, again, this is if it's opaque, it must be profound, right?
Exactly. But by the way, let me pull out my trump card in support of my theory, and I actually quote this in my forthcoming book. There was supposedly a conversation that John Searle, the American philosopher, recounts, where he's having a conversation with none other than Michel Foucault. Do you know the story? Do you know where I'm going with this?
No.
And he tells him, I mean, I'm paraphrasing. I'm not quoting verbatim. How come this is John Searle asking Michel Foucault, how come when I speak to you privately, now we're having a conversation, I seem to sort of understand everything that you're saying, but then when I read your stuff, it seems so confusing and impenetrable? To which Michel Foucault answers, well in line with my theory. He says, well, in France, if you don't speak in a way that confuses a lot of people, then you won't be taken seriously as someone who is saying something profound. So that certainly points to a premeditated attempt to bullshit through faux profundity.
Well, okay. So that. But I think in general, I don't think the intention was that, but I think the effect is that. I mean, yes. And there's a suspicion also that if you are profound, you are complicated.
Right.
And so if you're easily understandable, you must be superficial. So, there's a premium in that sense.
It kind of goes back to our vulgarization earlier, right? Where we talked about if you speak to the common person, then you must not be serious.
Exactly. And again, my retort, as we said, I mean, it's possible to be, to speak in different ways and not just wear one hat. But yes, I think basically the French intellectuals have had a terrible impact on this.
Do you feel it? Do you feel as though the trajectory of postmodernism is on its way out? Is it decreasing, or is it as strong? Given that I don't really navigate so much in the humanities and so on, I say 20 years ago, is it lesser, or is it as strong as ever?
No, I would say it's much lesser, but I also bolster your other point and say it's lesser within the departments, but it's spread elsewhere. And, we have this whole sense of everything is constructed, everything is invented. And again, I tell my students, well, there's a certain truth to that, but, buildings are constructed, but they stand up, right?
Right.
So, I mean, not anything can be constructed, but this lingo of narratives, construction, invention, which is coming out of postmodernism. I mean, everything is a contrivance. There's no real truth. I think is weaker within the departments, but stronger within the culture.
Exactly. Right. Well said. So going back to the original question I wanted to ask before being sidetracked by postmodernism, do you think that we could apply in fields that have academic, criticism, for example, literary criticism? Many of these fields, the epistemology, if I can call it that, of the critical approach is really informed by whatever ideological lens I come with to do the criticism. So, for example, if I am a Marxist, then I will read all of the literature narratives via a lens of Marxism. It's a struggle between classes. If I am a radical feminist, it's the patriarchy. It's a struggle between men trying to keep women down. If I'm a postmodernist, it's something else. Whereas, for example, there is a field well within my area of evolutionary psychology. The field is called Darwinian literary criticism, whereby you apply the lens of evolutionary theory to argue that there are certain universal themes in literature that are invariant to time and place, right? The reason why you and I today can read an ancient Greek poem and understand exactly what that author was saying, despite the fact that he doesn't know what a smartphone is and he doesn't know what a plane is. His software is identical to yours and mine, his human mind software. Therefore, we could apply the tools of evolutionary theory to study literary criticism. Similarly, so if I apply it to your official field of history, there is a Darwinian historian by the name of Laura Betzik who studies historical phenomena informed by the lens of evolutionary theory. So in this case, you are applying the scientific method to areas such as literary criticism or history, so they could be subsumed within the scientific enterprise. Why isn't there more of that? Or do you think that that whole enterprise that I'm saying is contrary to those fields? You shouldn't be mixing the scientific method with those fields.
First of all, I don't know anything about this Darwinian literary criticism.
But it's got you a bit curious, no?
Yeah, I'm very curious, yeah. I mean, there's certainly been efforts. I mean, the Marxists themselves saw themselves as scientists. So there was, the Marxist literary criticism saw itself in a scientific tradition. Now, it wasn't, but it saw itself. So I think one has to be a little careful about, what one's talking about when you're talking about scientific literary criticism, just as one's talking about scientific philosophy. What categories are you carrying over? We're dealing with some of the basic problems of the natural and human sciences and how one's using categories in one and the other. That's all. I don't know anything about Darwinian literary criticism.
So let me take a crack, maybe, to your question. Maybe it was a rhetorical question, but let me take a crack at it. The scientific method, obviously but let me just kind of restate it. There's a research question. There is a set of hypotheses. What is the type of data that I would need to collect to either falsify or not that hypothesis? I go out, I collect the data, and then I see what happens. There is no reason why I can't apply that epistemology, which is the only epistemology for deciding which ideas are good or not that I'm aware of, why I can't apply that to some historical phenomenon. So let me give an example from Laura Betzik, the Darwinian historian that I mentioned earlier. She wanted to demonstrate that if we do a content analysis of the Old Testament, which would be what, in the humanities you'd call hermeneutics, right? But hermeneutics just has anybody pontificating any BS that they want, right? Here, we don't have to pontificate. She wanted to see whether the evolutionary principle of the more status a male has, the more access to women he will have, right? This is a Darwinian principle. Men's social status correlates with their sexual access. Well, does this evolutionary principle found across all documented cultures, can I find it in the Old Testament? So she's got a very specific hypothesis. She goes into the Old Testament. She lists all of these male protagonists, calculates what their status is, general, prophet, farmer, slave, and then calculates how many women are ascribed to them, concubines, wives, sexual conquest, and then demonstrates that the empirical finding, the human universal of social status to sexual access found in all cultures is exactly found in the Old Testament. So you're applying the scientific method to a historical document, in this case, the Old Testament. Does that help in any way, or you don't buy into all this?
I don't. It doesn't help me.
No, but I mean, it doesn't help you in the sense of how you might apply a scientific approach to studying a historical document.
Then again, you're trying to invent the wheel. I mean, there have been many studies using word usage increasingly in terms of computers. Yes, look at old documents, look at word usage, look at try to come up with patterns. I think one of the problems is, and you can see it. I mean, I don't know what your exact field is, but there's a way to use science which comes up with banalities. We can prove, yes, that wealthy people had more access to women. Okay, I probably could have told you that, before your study began. So is that really illuminating anything particularly in these texts?
So you're saying there is something about the literary or the criticism process that is informed from something other than the scientific method that can offer us insights that don't have to fall under the rubric of the scientific method. That's what you're basically saying.
Okay, yes, I think there's a danger of using a methodology. Yes, you'll come up with something, but it'll not be terribly interesting.
Got it.
Be terribly illuminating. If you're going to count word usage or look up associations, and you can document it and graph it, and guess what? You haven't learned really much. Why these texts are still important, why they're illuminating about love or life or whatever. You've come up with some simple associations, which, okay, maybe they're true. So what?
I mean, the reason why I say it, I mean, I'm going to link it back to something we talked about earlier when we talked about the value of interdisciplinarity. E.O. Wilson, who is one of the famous public intellectuals, but also a very esteemed evolutionary biologist at Harvard, introduced or reintroduced back into our collective lexicon the word consilience, right? Consilience refers to unity of knowledge. And so he's talking about the seeking consilience across the humanities, the social sciences, and the natural sciences so that they could talk to one another. And so in that sense, what I'm arguing is there is a way using the epistemology of the scientific method to traverse. So I don't have to be either a positivist, an empiricist in evolutionary psychology, or a literary critic. The way that we could talk to each other is by agreeing on a common epistemology. So it is in that spirit of our mutual commitment to interdisciplinarity that I was asking that question. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes sense. I mean, I'm happy to entertain it. I'm just raising questions that, what is the methodology? I see I don't see all the time, but I mean, I think much of the science, like social psychology, well, you have grad students, and maybe this is close to your field, who have projects, they're using scientific methods, they're surveying students, and they're coming up with complete banalities.
Yes.
I mean, total banalities about, surveys about students, how they respond to colors, sound, whatever. And it's totally scientific, but the questions and the issues are so small and so banal that you wonder why they're pursuing it. But the method is perfect.
I couldn't agree with you more there. And let me, if you don't know this paper, I would urge you to read it. Whenever I'm asked to review papers, I mean, as an academic reviewer, I will often make exactly the point that you just made, which is, here is a terribly sophisticated methodological study, right? You did an experimental design using 2x3x4. You ran these unbelievably sophisticated mathematical analyses to then conclude that people who like a restaurant are more likely to return to that restaurant, right?
Exactly.
And so here, the paper that I love, which I think every graduate student, irrespective of what they study, should be forced to read, is a 1971 paper by a sociologist. The paper is called "That's interesting!" exclamation point, where he basically argues for 12 criteria that we should be using. Now, he's not arguing that these are the only criteria, but he's saying that for you to have the response to research as, wow, that's interesting, it should at least meet one of these 12 criteria. And are you familiar with the paper?
No.
I think, you know what, maybe offline I'll send you a copy. I think that's exactly right, because we train our graduate students to walk like academics, quack like academics, talk like academics, but then the final thing that they study is, as you said, exactly banal. How do we get around that, according to you?
But I mean, that circles around. But on one hand, you're telling me we can use science to look at literature. Fair enough, I think. But I'm saying look at what the scientists themselves are doing in psychology and social psychology. I mean, they have a method, but what they're looking at is often so banal. Students respond to noise. A child cries when it's unhappy. They have these endless studies. You look through the journals of social psychology and you say, why are people studying this? I mean, I could have told them, 10 years ago that this was true. I mean, it's like, so again, this is the issue of specialization and how to get people to, address issues which are more urgent and important, as opposed to simply building up their CV with, papers that no one will challenge because no one's interested in them. They're perfect, but they're also, irrelevant.
I think the opposite problem has now creeped into many editors' mindsets, where precisely probably to counter the concern that you're having and that I've agreed with, which is producing methodologically rigorous but terribly banal studies, they now specifically select papers that are counterintuitive and surprising, right? And so that also creates an artifact of the scientific process, because now, you run 15 studies, the ones that seem to support your folk psychology, you file in the drawer, and only that one result that seems contrary to our naive intuitions do we then publish. So there's the opposite problem, right?
Yes, and again, I have not kept up with this, but people who look at, like citation, studies of citation, I think point this out. If you write a paper which is really defective and counterintuitive, you'll get a lot of citations, right? You're challenging something, but it's not a good paper. But, if you just look at your number of citations, you're important, right? You wrote a big paper, right? Which is clearly false.
Right.
So in some sense, that runs into that problem of being sort of idiosyncratic for the reasons of being idiosyncratic.
Exactly. Speaking of which, how come, and I'm mindful of your time, I'm not sure how you're doing on time, but we're at about an hour and 15 minutes now. I could keep you here, as we were joking prior to our going live. We could speak about this for 10 hours. Why did you choose as your main vehicle for communication much more books than the standard peer-reviewed papers? Is it simply because that was the style with which you want to make a long argument rather than the standard sort of template of how we make arguments in academic papers?
Well, it is both, but I think I did run across this problem. If you're writing for peer-reviewed journals, you're writing very small pieces that people, that are narrow and which reviewers will not, challenge. And if you're writing, if you want to address bigger issues, you're not going to get them into these peer-reviewed journals. So that's so books become a more feasible option than writing peer-reviewed articles, because they're subject to 1,000 critiques.
Right. What would be earlier you were mentioning that some of your students are aspiring intellectuals. So to any viewers who are aspiring authors, what would be, say, a couple of pieces of advice that you'd give aspiring authors? Let's go with book authors, of what they should be doing as part of the practice of being good authors.
change careers would be the first one.
You mean get out of academia?
Try dental school or something, or dental hygiene, something like that. Uh,
But how about in the mechanics of writing, like in the art of writing? What are some tools of the tricks of the trade that you would espouse?
for writing books,
Yes.
again, you have to go with your passion, really. I mean, you can't gauge the market and try to figure out what your contribution is. I sent you a link to just this publishing this recent book, which all the university presses turned it down.
I didn't want to say it actually because I didn't know if that was information, because your publisher had told me that. I didn't want to ask it to you because I don't know if you want to. So maybe you could talk about that. Why did that happen?
Well, I think it was typical. I mean, the point is, I was taking on diversity, and they sent it out to people, and there were certainly some sympathetic viewers, but they got nervous, like, well, this is taking on diversity. Let's get a diversity expert to look at this. Well, the diversity expert went haywire. I mean, went nuts. Like, this is you can't, a university press can't publish a book like this. This is a critique of diversity. And I ran across this again and again. I mean, I went through 8 or 9 university presses, and they would never come to a conclusion, or they said, no, we can't do it. So in that sense, it's a similar story to writing peer-reviewed articles. I mean, your life could drip away before you get the approval of the 10 reviewers and write the article that has no objection and provokes no one and is acceptable to everyone. It'll be posthumous by that point.
Well, by the way, I think without maybe necessarily you framing it this way in your brain, you've given a very important piece of advice, which is if you want to be an author, you better have thick enough skin to have the psychological makeup to withstand endless rejections, right? That really is part of the game.
Yes, and again, or a trust fund too, and someone who's supporting you, because it's tough out there if you're going to earn a living this way. So yeah.
So do you when is the book? So I guess we'll wrap it up shortly. When is the book is coming out in February 2020? Correct?
Yes.
Very good. Any other projects that you are currently working on that you might want to use this forum to promote before we wrap it up?
My obituary I'm working on. I don't want to, I don't want to trust anyone else with that. So I'm going to put my finishing touches on that.
May you live for another 50 years of happiness and productivity, sir.
I don't think so. But it's been nice chatting with you.
You too. Stay on the line so that we can say goodbyes offline. Thank you so much, Russell, for coming. And I wish you the best of luck with the book.
Okay, thank you.